Okay, I think we're ready to start. Thank you all for coming. Without any further delays, I'm pleased to introduce the speaker for today, my good old friend, Dr. Salim Adib. Dr. Adib is a medically trained epidemiologist. He holds an MD from St. Joseph University and a doctorate of public health from the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. He has been involved in different academic and public consultations between the US and the Gulf. He also served as the manager of the public health department of the Emirate of Abu Dhabi between 2010 and 2012. And he also served as an international expert for the non-communicable diseases department at the WHO AMRO in Cairo. Also, Dr. Adib also serves as the chair of the examination committee of the Arab Board for Family and Community Medicine and as a member of the International Epidemiological Association Council for the MENA region since 2014. And he is currently a professor of public health practice at the AUB Department of Epidemiology and Population Health. Dr. Adib.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Do we really need the, to use the microphone? Okay. So this morning, I want to take you through a historical trip related to the way epidemiology has been responding to changes in concepts and contexts throughout history. And it's only natural that epidemiology would do so because epidemiology is involved with the people from the beginning. And as the Greek root that you all know reminds us, it's epidemos, the science of something that falls on the people, which is the epidemic in itself. And whenever the people's concepts change, then epidemiology, of course, would change with it. Epidemics have been with us from the very beginning of human history. Of course, the nicest description, if nice is the right word, nicest description in classical antiquity can be found in the Peloponnesian War that many of you have been studied in SBS 101. There's a famous description of plague in Athens by Thucydides. The city under siege is going through a terrible plague. And the description of it shows that back then there was really no concept of how to stop this. And for several, whether before or after it, and for several centuries, the only explanation for epidemics was that it was some sort of divine retribution. And we can find the first trace of this concept of linking epidemics to some sort of divine retribution, divine punishment, in a biblical text, Deuteronomy, which must have been written about 2000 before Christ. It says, after giving the Mosaic law, the law of Moses, God commanded the people to obey it or suffer many evils, including epidemics. The Lord will strike you with wasting disease, with fever, with inflammation, which will plague you until you perish. And so for centuries, if that was the concept, it was difficult to imagine being able to control an epidemic, i.e. fighting against God. And so the only way of dealing with this was to actually get back to God and do some sort of penance. And so the concept was going on for up till the Middle Ages, when Europe was stricken by the Black Death, the plague epidemic of the 14th century. It found itself also unable to think beyond these religious concepts. The plague of the 14th century started somewhere in what is now Russia, but what used to be the Mongol Khanate, somewhere in the middle of the steppes here. About 1 year later, it started going down through with the caravans through the Persian Empire all the way to Baghdad and out, and then down this is the Volga, to the Black Sea and out into the Mediterranean. Within 3 more years, it had hit the big cities of the Eastern Mediterranean and down to the pilgrimage in Mecca, and gone up to the southern European ports. In 1351, it reached London. And so this is probably the oldest well-documented pandemic of the known world back then. And it took about 5 to 6 years to reach its maximum extension. In all places, it was lived as a major dramatic situation. It really, whole cities had to be closed down because of the Black Death, and it was the artists imagined the description of it as black demons hovering over the cities. This is a representation from Germany around that period. And because of the religious concept of what is an epidemic, the response was religious. And so they had processions, incense, all sorts of attempts to assuage the divine wrath, except at some point the Venetian Republic, the Republic of Venice, which was heading a big maritime empire and needed to get commerce going on and could not afford to have epidemics stopping the course of business, started asking a bit more pointed questions. Really, can we do something rather than just going around with incense? And so some doctors started to propose approaches that could work or not, but that were a bit of changing from the original concepts. The beak here is one of the doctors that dealt with plague. For centuries, it was thought that diseases were transmitted by bad odors. And so the doctors had to wear this mask with the beak. The beak was full of cotton, and the cotton was filled with perfume, so that the perfume would stop the bad odors from transmitting the disease to the doctor while they're dealing with the issue of controlling the disease. But really, it was around that time, the 15th century, that the Phoenician doctors came up with, the doctors from Venice, Budnuqiyya, came up with the first concept that could work, which is really separating the well from the sick, trying to put a difference between an area where there is sickness and an area where people were still in good health. We could find a common sense approach to this also in some of the hadith. I am reporting here a hadith from the Shaykhain that really talks about stay away. If you hear of a plague, do not go into that city and do not come out of the city. And so that is the concept that has come down to us historically as being quarantine. And quarantine, the word quarantine, is an Italian word that indicates how much they did not know what they were doing by separating people. And so they figured out we need to stop the transmission. How long does it take to stop the transmission? What is a good figure? And again, the religious symbols came back, and they figured out, well, if it took Christ 40 days during the big Lent in the Christian communities to go from a situation where I'm just a human being to a situation where, I have a mission, 40 days, therefore 40 days seems to be a good time. So let's have it as 40 days, quaranta, and hence the quarantina. And as you can see, this is an edict of the city of New York in, in 1919, fighting the first modern time pandemic, the Spanish flu. It was still being used at the beginning of the 20th century, and each now and then it is reused, although it's not totally effective. But it made sense, and it was the only thing that really we could imagine as epidemiologists for several centuries. But in reality, we know that diseases will eventually reach a balanced point when all the elements are in place, not only the pathogen, which is a necessary cause of disease, but also when the hosts reach a certain level of either vulnerability or the opposite of it, and also when the environment is conducive to things. So with common sense, epidemiologists try to intervene on either one of these elements of this, what we call the triad. They were helped by by several serendipitous situations, whereby the modifications, the modifications of the living conditions of human populations have resulted into changing the dynamics of epidemics. And it's almost like we retroactively attributed some of this progress in epidemics control to situations that were totally outside our will, but that turned out to be a good thing. This is an example. In 1665-66, London went through its highest, most serious epidemic of plague that really hit about 100,000 deaths in 7 months. It was so serious that they called it forever the Great Plague of London. Plague used to return every about 50 to 60 years, but that was a major event. But 1666 was also the year of the Great Fire of London. In September 1666, a central part of London was built with wooden material and used to be also the most vulnerable lower socioeconomic region of London, just burned out. And it was a major dramatic event. After the Great Fire of London, plague stopped. There was no more plague in London. Well, no, the municipality of London decided that from now on, we don't want these fires to happen, so we're going to build the center of the city in stone. And so wood and wooden basements were not there anymore to harbor rats. And rats, as you well know, are the reservoir of the zoonosis called plague, which each now and then, when there is an epizootic disease in rats, would tend to go out and invade human communities also. So by killing the habitat of rats and probably burning them during the Great Fire and making sure that they're not back, something happened in the ecology of the city that led to the stopping of this ongoing cycle of plague in London. So each now and then the modifications brought in by extreme conditions have helped us win some victory on epidemics. The rats, the culprits.
They are in Paris now, did you see?
Yes, because of the flooding. Public hygiene and sanitation also caused major progress in infection control throughout mostly the 18th and the 19th century. There was a period when those big cities of Europe that we think of as the major centers of culture and civilization were actually filthy cities. And it took some time to deal with it. During that period of changes in lifestyles and modification of concepts of how do we go about organizing urban life, there are some few names that appear that we consider in epidemiology as being major names in our history. One of them is this gentleman, John Snow, who was a very curious physician, intellectually curious, interested in all sorts of things. Among them, he was interested in anesthesia and was able to figure out the right amount of anesthesia to give to a patient to make them stop feeling any pain during surgery, but not dying from the excess of anesthesia. And it was just on time, because then he was able to use that anesthesia with Queen Victoria, who was laboring at some point and had problems delivering, and it worked, and he became the surgeon of the Queen, and he was given a nobility title. But he was determined to explain what was happening with cholera, another recurring problem in London. The consensus around that period was still that cholera was caused by bad odors, bad smells. He had a hypothesis that it's actually carried by water, that is contaminated by human sewage. And his approach was probably the first one who decided to show this quantitatively using rates. And so what he did is look at some of the districts in London that were serviced through companies, water companies that got their water from downstream Thames River, versus those who got it from upstream river. Let me explain this, why this is important. The city of London the River Thames goes through the city of London, and it serves as the main source of drinking water for the city. And so different companies in different neighborhoods would draw water from the river and distribute it through homes, through pumps. But also the River Thames was also the sewage drainage of the city. And so this is a major city in Europe that is drinking and drinking from the same source in which it was emptying its sewage. The idea of snow is that, therefore, if fecal matter is a contamination, probably if we draw water from upstream before the river goes into the city, it will be less contaminated and healthier than if we draw it from more downstream. And so he was able to show this by drawing rates. For the first time, he had a numerator of deaths and the denominator of number of houses, and he showed that the areas that were downstream had higher rates higher mortality rates from cholera than those who were upstream, and compared to the mean death rate of the entire city. And so that was a first argument that he could use in strongly showing that the approach should be controlling water and not trying to run away from the odors. And so this is a picture showing that if you stop the water coming from the pump from being contaminated, then you can kill the cholera king, represented here like in this form here. Other approaches to hygiene were also very important in reducing epidemics and contributing to eliminating several important diseases. Let me give you this example of an observation from a gynecologist, an Austrian gynecologist called Ignaz Semmelweis, who observed in his own practice in Vienna General Hospital at the end of the 19th century that lots of women were dying from puerperal sepsis, Humma Nufath, which is a benign streptococcal infection, streptococcal, mazboot. And it occurred during delivery, infecting the delivery process, and it led to the death of the mother during birth. And you know how much this idea of she died while giving birth was part of human literature and throughout the 19th century. He noticed that if the physicians doing the delivery just washed their hands before starting the work, this infection did not occur. And so that in reality, it was an infection that was communicating from the doctor to the lady delivering during the operation of delivery. And so he recommended that this should be done in all delivery rooms. Of course, because he was in Austria, the word was not, his information was not, did not spread very fast. But eventually, all of Vienna started doing it, and their figures went down to 0 for maternal mortality due to puerperal sepsis. We had this disease on the list of communicable diseases in Lebanon all the way till 1993, and then we removed it because it had disappeared. Okay, and the beginning of the winning story was with just washing your hands before delivering your patient. So another issue that we had to deal with in trying to control epidemics was the fact that agents now, regardless of environment, the agents have a way of changing their own pathogenicity, their own genetic material that makes them that affects their epidemiological dynamics, and we have to survive to live with this. One of the good examples is the change in the genetic composition of the cholera agent. Cholera has been described since 1817 for going through 7 major pandemics. The first 6 occurred all around before early in the 20th century. They were caused by what used to be called the classical biotype of Vibrio cholerae. Usually they started in Asia and spread to other continents. The 7th pandemic began in Indonesia in 1961, affected more countries and continents than the previous 6 epidemics, but it was much less deadly. And so cholera remains in the collective memory as something that goes throughout the world and kills lots of people. But the 7th pandemic, although it did go throughout the world and affect a whole lot of regions, it was much less lethal than in the past. It was caused by a new strain of Vibrio cholerae, not the classical one, but one that was called now El-Tor. And this change in itself helped in controlling the dangers and severity of pandemics due to cholera. Thank you. Of course, the epitome of mutations that appear in one strain and then become a major problem throughout the world is HIV/AIDS. Okay, HIV/AIDS is really a mutation in a previously known family of viruses, and the mutation that led to the appearance of HIV/AIDS was not the current mutation. Was not the first time it had ever occurred. But in this situation, this is the first report of one of the first few reports that occurred in the Morbidity Mortality Weekly report. This is 1981. First cases of Kaposi sarcoma and Homocystis carini among homosexual men, New York City and California. These were the first reports that led to the definition of what is HIV and what is AIDS. The mutation that has led to the appearance of this virus has always been there, but what has changed is that the way this mutation is amplified has changed with the 21st century, and so this is we're still the 20th century. So a mutation that would happen in an isolated community somewhere in the middle of Africa may remain there and never spread away. But a mutation that occurs in a large busy city like New York City or in places where people mix up and none of them is immune to that change would lead to major outbreaks like this one. So this is the culprit in question. I have here a documentation of an AIDS case that happened about 20 years earlier than the first cases of the 1980s. This is a case in 1968, which had occurred in St. Louis, Missouri, in the heart of the American continent. This was republished in JAMA later, a bit after the HIV virus was finally defined, and it really indicated a story of a young man, sexually active but had never left St. Louis, Missouri, who died with signs that were so mysterious that the coroner did not give the okay to bury that person before they had taken specimens of all the fluids and tissues and frozen them for future investigation to figure out what did this man die from. And it's only when finally a serological test was available in 1984-85 that took out those specimens of that death in 1968, and lo and behold, it was HIV, the same strain, the same virus. And so this brings us again to the triad and to understanding that an agent that mutates by itself may or may not lead to a serious situation, but if that mutation happens within a context of changing behaviors and changing human concentration, then you have a potential for a major eruption that can go pandemic. In reality, for several centuries, the only effective control that epidemiologists had was provided by nature. Nature would provide us with what we call herd immunity, natural immunity, which will eventually help in stopping an epidemic. So a first wave comes in a population that is immunologically naive. First wave is very deadly. Lots of people die. Those who survive get immune to this agent. And when the second wave comes in, it will find a bit more people who are immune, and then and so on and so forth until everybody is immune, and then the epidemic stops. And so even if we don't have a treatment or any vaccine, in most cases, an epidemic would be deadly, but eventually would stop simply because of herd immunity. And this is really the strength of HIV/AIDS. The reason why it never really stopped, it's because the virus attacks the very cells that help in forming the immunity and creating a herd immunity. And so we never had a collective immunity against HIV. The other problem of herd immunity is that it fades over time. So if the exposure stops, the generation that got exposed is still immune, but the following exposure, the following generation does not have that immunity. And then slowly the immunity goes away. And so if the agent for some reason comes back into that population, the cycle starts again. It may start with lots of severity. The typical example is the outbreak of measles in the Faroe Islands that was described by a Danish doctor called Panum in 1846. Okay, the Faroe Islands are a small isolated archipelago to the north of Scotland in the Northern Sea that belongs to Denmark for some reason. And for more than a century, these isolated islands had not known any case of measles. And so after the last few cases of measles had occurred in the islands, with population sufficiently immune against measles, the following generations did not come in contact with measles, and so at one point they had no immunity left against measles. And then in one wintry night, a British fishing boat, wrecked on the Faroe Islands, and the population of the islands rushed out to save the sailors and bring them into their homes and wait for the next ship to come and rescue them, which won't happen until the next season, because it was difficult to get ships out in the winter in those rough seas. And those sailors who were carrying with them measles, because they were coming from endemic areas of the UK, actually spread the virus again on the island. The end result is that during that winter and the following spring, about 40 to 50% of the population actually died from measles because they had no immunity whatsoever to it. And so by the time the expedition led by Wilhelm Panum reached the Faroe Islands, as you see them quite isolated in between Iceland and Scotland, the catastrophe was quite major. And so the nice thing that happened later around that time is that we figured out a way of helping Mother Nature in keeping the collective immunity. And this came from observing that in some places there is a way of people were thinking of ways of acquiring immunity while not acquiring the disease. The first such observations are self-attributed by the Turks to the Ottoman Empire. And maybe they are right, because Lady Mary Montagu was the wife of the ambassador to the Ottoman Empire around the mid of the 17th century. And she observed a practice among doctors in Istanbul to supposedly protect people against measles, against smallpox. And she observed that what they did is obtain some pus from the people who actually had smallpox and inject them in people who did not have smallpox. Now, the concept is quite dangerous, because literally you are taking a disease that is potentially mortal and re-injecting it into people who did not have it under the guise of protecting them. This was called variolation, okay? And she started writing home to the UK saying, look, this seems to be working, this is good. And then she had already had smallpox, so she could not try it on herself because she was already immune. But she tried it, and this is interesting, talk about IRB. She tried it on her nearly 5-year-old son during an epidemic of measles of smallpox while they were still in station in Istanbul. And then several years later, when they were back in England, she had her daughter inoculated. These were the first such operations done in trying to create some form of acquired immunity. Later on, they tried them on 7 prisoners at Newgate Prison who were awaiting execution, and they offered them either to get variolized and pardoned, or to go through execution. they all picked up the injection, and fortunately, they all survived and they were released. So it was considered as a successful trial, but the danger was still there, and cases of actual smallpox, flaring smallpox were happening through variolization. But fortunately enough, about the time when Lady Mary died, there was a 13-year-old boy called Edward Jenner who would grow up to become a doctor, and a rural doctor in Britain, and who would observe a much safer technique, which was actually used in rural England in taking material not from smallpox, but cowpox, another type of pox fever that occurred in cows and not in humans. And the population in those rural areas had observed empirically over several centuries that the farm girls who milked the cows that were actually suffering from cowpox ended up being protected against smallpox. And so he figured out, rather than taking material that is outright from smallpox and can be very pathogenic, why don't we try to use material from the cowpox? And now we're not going to call it variolation, but vaccination. And that vaccination ended up working well, and it was the first vaccine that was ever available for human use. It helped us move from just counting on herd immunity to actually building acquired immunity. And that start of smallpox made it possible for smallpox to actually be eradicated, to disappear from the space of human, from human pathology. This is the official document of WHO, UN actually, signed in 1980 with all the different languages of the United Nations. You can see in Arabic and Chinese and what have you, that declared the world free of smallpox. And so from 1980 to today, we stopped vaccinating because smallpox is gone. There's no such virus, which means our herd immunity is going down. I am still immune, and people by generation, but anyone born after 1980 has no immunity against smallpox. And so if for some reason, any reason, smallpox comes back, it may lead to a major pandemic. So smallpox is still under surveillance, although it should not be existing anymore. But whether it still exists or not is another conversation that we can have one day. But soon enough, after smallpox, other vaccines were created. The more we understood what is the nature of agents and bacteria and viruses, the more there was a capacity of building new vaccines. This is Salk, the father of the polio vaccine, the injectable polio vaccine, followed by a few years later, 1961, by Sabin, the inventor of the oral polio vaccine. And the discovery of the oral polio vaccine made it possible to actually work towards eradication of polio worldwide. And we're almost at the brink of that, because at this point, the wild polio virus transmission exists only in 2, maybe 3 countries. Nigeria is in and out of the list each now and then, but we have Pakistan and Afghanistan still going on. But it seems possible to finally eradicate polio and control that disease. So meanwhile, as we move from using nature to mimicking nature to reproducing nature through vaccination and using changes in hygiene and changes in our environment to help control diseases, in the Middle East, we were also knowing some changes in epidemiology that may be tracked back to the arrival of Bliss and the construction, the erection of the first of the medical school at what used to be called the Syrian Protestant College about 150 years ago. This is the original buildings as we more or less can still see it erected. That first school had probably the first people whom we can call epidemiological practitioners. Probably the oldest documented is this gentleman, John Vartabet, who was a professor of pathology in reality, but was interested in the dynamics and the control of epidemics. And so we know that he has left some publications. This one is in The Lancet, in 1881 about an outbreak of trichinosis in Khiam, okay? The village of Khiam near the principal sources of the Jordan. So that's probably the oldest documentation of an outbreak that was investigated and controlled in the Middle East. He also came up with an important monogram that was shared with the medical board in Edinburgh on the epidemics and endemic diseases in Syria, Syria being the entire region back then in 1905. A few years later, I think in 1908, he died, 1908, and his obituary was reported in the British Medical Journal as someone who had done all sorts of important things in Syria and Egypt. On the other side of town, also the French had harried to create a school of medicine a few years after the Americans. You know, the area could not be left only to the Protestants, so the Catholics rushed in, and so that's how we ended up having two good schools of medicine that are more than 100 years ago. This is on the French side. The collaboration was very large with the Ottoman authorities back in the turn of the century. These are the Jesuit Fathers who used to be the teachers of the faculty, French Faculty of Medicine. The doctors that were graduated from this school were also part of the public health system of the Ottoman Empire, and so many of them actually perished during World War I. Meanwhile, we went through World War I and World War II, and the Allied armies came into Lebanon. And you know, when you live in a country, you're in balance in the triad with the agents that exist in this country. So you have herd immunity, you don't suffer from the problems that exist. But when a foreign army comes into your country, they go through major havoc with the local agents. And the Australians went through a major epidemic of malaria as they came into Lebanon during World War II. And so they started a systematic work that was picked up later on by the Lebanese government to fight the mosquitoes that carry malaria. And there's this interesting picture that I can't remember where I found it, of the DDT boys organized in Tripoli carrying this machine, the distribution of DDT, around 1945. I actually showed it to in some place where someone from Tripoli told me, well, look, this is my grandfather or something. You know, I said, oh yes, we used to have this DDT thing. Okay, so apparently this paid off because, you know, by 1961 malaria had been eliminated in Lebanon. The Anopheles disappeared, and so we stopped the transmission of malaria altogether. Other successes in Lebanon are the control of tuberculosis. 1901, the first sanatorium in the Middle East outside Istanbul was built in Mam el-Tain to the north of Beirut. It was transferred later on to Dar el-Beshi and still there, but it's not a sanatorium anymore. It's now a general public hospital. The treatments back then were only providing fresh air, good food, iron and calcium. I suppose Dar el-Beshi back then was really, you know, in good air and up there in the mountains of Lebanon. Ooh. And so, of course, now it's almost within Beirut, so I have no idea what fresh air they can tell. And NGOs appeared in the middle of the 20s to help not only the patients, but their families of the patients. The patients would be removed to the sanatorium, and then the families would be left without any help or support. And so the NGO Noor wa Ighatha started gathering gifts throughout Syria and Lebanon to help the patients of tuberculosis, the families of patients, and it helped in controlling, because when you know that your family will be taken care of, you don't hide your signs. We used to have this problem in Abu Dhabi. Whenever someone starts coughing blood from India or Pakistan, the workers, they would hide the signs because they knew that the moment they declare it to a doctor, they would be removed. Meanwhile, they're coughing out and contaminating everybody else in the camp, and it reached really very serious dimensions at some points. The only sanatorium still working in Lebanon at this point was built by the Armenian Church in 1937. It's in Azuniye, near Suq al-Gharb, and it still attracts patients from throughout the Middle East that come to Azuniya whenever it's needed. We have other landmarks that have helped us deal with these infections. For TB, certainly the creation of a national TB control program helped in bringing down the incidence of tuberculosis to very controllable levels, i.e. that is until of course the recent crisis of the refugees coming into Lebanon. In 1955, a School of Public Health was started at AUB, which became later on the Faculty of Health Sciences. Some of our stellar professors are here. You can see a picture of Dr. Joseph Azar, whom some of you have known. This is in 1946 when he was much younger than the way we remembered him. This is a picture of the Department of Epidemiology in the early 60s. You may recognize Dr. Nabil Haddad, who's still alive and kicking in Bahrain. And next to him, Dr. Kamal Boudaoud. Kamal Boudaoud is probably the father of modern epidemiology in Lebanon. He single-handedly created a whole lot of seminal publications which were our reference points for several years until the Civil War was over and we could start publishing our own papers. But for like a decade, he was the only one doing epidemiological research in Lebanon. And every time we want to know about the historical progress of diseases, and not only communicable diseases, mind you, he was there and his references are still there. He started his professorial track in 1963 after being in medicine, and essentially went on till 1982. I encountered him in 1986, but he was already retired, and he died in 1991. After the Civil War stopped, we had to work on epidemiology again. This is an epidemic of cholera that occurred in 1993, about 6 months after I had returned from the United States. After the Civil War had destroyed the entire infrastructure of water and sewage, and there was a whole lot of anastomosis between the two. And so each now and then there was a flare-up of cholera. First one was in 1991 in Tripoli, but it remained there. The second one in 1993 actually spread out throughout the coastline of Lebanon. And there were cases of death, fatality cases, and that made it pretty serious. So the Ministry of Public Health demanded that AUB helps out in investigating that outbreak, which probably was the first time I ever tried myself on an outbreak of infectious diseases. I had been in the United States. You don't learn about cholera outbreaks in the United States. And so this is primitive approach to the epidemiological curve as we were able to make it in 1993. But after that, it was important to deal with the issue of epidemiological survey, and that's how we decided there was a decision to reactivate an epidemiological surveillance unit. We volunteered several students from this faculty. Ziad Arnaout, who graduated in 1994, maybe some of you remember him, was volunteered for several years. Now he's directing a medical hospital in Saudi Arabia, followed by John Jabour, who had just finished his MPH here. And then by 1997, Dr. Anada Ghassan picked up the position, and she's still in there. Started publishing Epi News in 1996 with some of the faculty members here being on the publication board. And in 2002, we edged as epidemiological surveillance into the non-communicable diseases with the creation of the National Cancer Registry. We are moving away of the ages of pestilence and diseases. You know, this is called the epidemiological transition. It was described by Omran in 1971. He says we're getting to the end of the age of big communicable disease epidemics, and they're going to be replaced by degenerative diseases, diseases of wear and tear due to the accumulation of lesions in longer lives. And so we had to redefine epidemiology because the epidemics are disappearing. We had to redefine it as a science and a practice that is interested in more than just communicable diseases. And so the most widely accepted definition now is the one that proposed by Last in 1988. that suggests epidemiology to be the study of the distribution and determinants of any event that is health-related, and not only health or disease, and not only communicable diseases. In specific populations, this is the study, so knowledge generation. And then there's another aspect to epidemiology, the application of this study to the control of health problems. In last mind, epidemiology cannot just be a knowledge-based study. It has to be also skills and competence-based and applied to real life situations. There are different schools of thoughts on this, and we're not done yet with the conversation on what should an epidemiologist really do. But before this, and this would be the end, the last of my probably the end of my slides. Are infectious epidemics really a thing of the past? Well, heck no. You know, they found a way of going around with new risks such as lifestyle changes, environmental contamination, climate changes. We find that mutant viruses are amplified in big cities where the population are immunologically naive. There's a potential for big explosions. Viruses are transmitted in large urban centers, typical HIV. Rapid international transmission, a disease that starts in Hong Kong can end up before the end of the day in Australia. The second day it's in Canada, and the following day it's all over the world. And this has happened in 2003, 2004 with SARS, the severe acute respiratory syndrome, which started in Hong Kong. A few days later was in Vietnam. A few weeks later was across Australasia, and a few weeks later, actually I must have, yes, SARS, you see. Now, please remember that it took several years for plague to go from Russia all the way to London. Now, SARS, which starts in Hong Kong, ends up in America and Europe in matters of 8 weeks. So here we have an amplification of the situation that is probably the sad part of globalization. And this is Toronto closed down to stop SARS, full quarantine. But now we have international health regulations that will help us go through global alerts and global response as soon as there is a potential for international pandemic. And so the story goes on. We still need to check out the communicable diseases, but they're not totally dead, and we have to face everything else. Thank you. Questions? Allah معك سيدنا.
For a very nice presentation. I really enjoyed it from minute one. I think you mentioned something related to the way pathogens are spread, but the role of humans in allowing that. So the anti-vax movement that is contributing to the repair of all diseases. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, one classical example is Ebola. In 1994, was it? There was a flare-up in what used to be called Zaire back then, and so the virus had been located in one area that was a bit far away from Kinshasa, the capital, and this disease is so lethal that it did not have the time to reach a big center. Anyone traveling away would die on the way, and so. The epidemic remained very localized and died out in that area of Zaire, although there was an international alert about it. In 2013, when the epidemic started again in a border region between Liberia and Sierra Leone and Guinea, it was happening because actually the cities had bursted out with so much population that they had basically come into inside the jungle and were in immediate confrontation with an epidemic of Ebola that was happening among monkeys, and so the monkeys were dying basically on the footsteps of the city, and they were picked up for bush meat, which is seen in Africa as being a healthy type of meat, which generated a major problem that exploded to thousands of people now agglomerated in those big places, And we were, at this time, we were really scared because, you know, you get Ebola in a plane from Liberia to anywhere else, and it takes 3 to 4 hours, and then you have it in another continent. Fortunately, it did not happen, but this is the risk now. You bring in a virus into a village that has 3,000 people. It may kill them all, but it won't get anywhere. We bring it into a city of 3 million people, it will start killing lots of people before we ever notice. And by the time you notice, the epidemic is all over the place. And that's one of the challenges, really. Did I respond to your question?
No, I don't think so. But I was mentioning the no-tax movement. So
no-tax movement?
No vaccination. The movements.
I see. Oh, my God. No, this is a very dangerous situation. This is a very dangerous situation. It's probably due to the fact that we know in human behaviors one of the most serious incentive to taking precautions is to visualize the problem. Okay, it worked very well for safer sex when you could actually see cases of AIDS going down the street. You know, you could see a sarcoma, not in Lebanon probably, but you could see a Kaposi sarcoma walking down the street as I was in the US. You know? And so safer sex worked. But now, no one has seen for a long period of time a case of polio. In our classes, when we were kids, we had one polio case probably in every class. A kid with this horrible contraption, having to live and being bullied by everybody. It was present to our eyes. What is polio? What is measles? Now with the success of vaccination, you have all sorts of communities living as if it never happened. But it does. It has happened, and it's still happening. And if we let our guard down, it will come back and it will spread again. Having said this, the pharmaceutical companies are always building new vaccines and declaring that these are absolutely essential vaccines. Well, we cannot just because the vaccines are there adopt them. Okay, we cannot just scrap everything. But adopting new vaccines have to be made on the basis of epidemiological surveillance. If you want me to start a new vaccine, we need to have over several years a surveillance of that disease to see if really it's cost-effective or cost-beneficial to go into this and to add it to the calendar. Otherwise, what we have now has allowed us to decrease infant mortality rate by zillions of magnitude throughout the world, and it would be silly to stop now when we have not eradicated those diseases.
Other questions? If I may, I have a question for you.
Tfadl.
Looking at what you presented, the history is very interesting, but it's important to think about the future. What do you think are the future directions of epidemiology in light of everything else that's happening in other disciplines? We're living in the omics era, and living there of genomics, well,
one day we need to discuss the new epidemiology. This is more the evolution of the traditional epidemiology, the communicable disease epidemiology. But certainly today, non-communicable diseases are the bulk of what we do, and the comprehension of the causes of those NCDs has evolved from the most basic social, behavioral, biological understanding to the most micro levels of understanding the issue, to the molecular and submolecular, to the genetic, to the subgenetic. And I think that's the future, really. But meanwhile, we still have to work on everything else, because an acute advance in science will not profit the majority of the people of the world until several years later. That we know. So maybe we should talk about that in some other installment. I think it's absolutely essential that we become aware of this.
Another seminar.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.